Hey, Newbie Dan here. This is part 2 of a new video series on how to tune up your table saw. In this video, I show how to align your table saw's fence to the blade. In part 1, I showed how to align your blade to the miter track. You should align your blade to the miter track first before aligning your fence to the blade. So if you haven't watched part 1 yet, you should do that now before continuing with this video. You're still here? Good. On with part 2. Before we do any measurements, a quick word about extensions. If your saw has an extension that you open and close, make sure you close it and that it is completely closed. No gaps between the extension or the table, and it's snug on both ends of the table. I'll discuss this again in a few minutes. As we did in part 1, we're going to use the board instead of the blade again. We'll also use our 2x4 jig and the dial indicator. Attach the dial indicator to the jig like this so we can use it against the fence like this. My jig doesn't seem to lie flat enough on the table and flat enough against the fence to get repeatable measurements. So I've attached the jig to a scrap piece of plywood that I know is flat and has a straight edge here that I can put against the fence. I'm using screws from underneath, so I countersank them and sanded the edges of the holes so I can be sure the board lies flat on the table. You don't necessarily have to do this, but if you have trouble getting consistent readings, you might consider it. Before placing it on the table, check the bottom and edge of the jig or the board to make sure it's clean. Stray sawdust and other particles can affect the measurements. You should do this every time you take the jig off the table and then put it back on. Move the fence so the dial indicator's pin presses against the board on the center line while the jig is still against the fence, then lock down the fence. Put a mark on the board where the pin hits it. Now, while making sure the jig is against the fence, tap the board a few times and zero out the gauge. It may take a few tries because the jig isn't clamped down, so it tilts easily when you tap on the zero button. You may have to settle for being off by 1/1000th of an inch. Just remember that when you calculate the differences. Then, just like in part 1, move everything to the other end with the pin on your mark. Make sure the jig is against the fence and tap the board a few times and check the measurements. Move it back and forth multiple times and check the readings until you're sure you're getting about the same fairly consistent readings. You probably won't get the exact same readings. There's just too many factors that can affect the readings. But if you can repeatedly get close, then you're good. If you don't get consistent readings, keep watching. I'll give you some troubleshooting tips. The next thing we need to check is to make sure that when we lock the fence, it locks with the same alignment or close to the same each time. If it doesn't, it's going to be kind of hard to align it properly. So unlock your fence, move it a little, then relock it. Then repeat the entire process, including zeroing out the indicator. You should get about the same readings, give or take 1/1000th of an inch. If you don't get about the same readings after having moved the fence, try the whole process again. If you continue to have problems after unlocking and relocking your fence, then you may have issues with your fence not keeping the same line when you lock it. Good luck with that. If your table saw has an extension that you open and close, there's one final thing to check. You need to open the extension, then reclose it, and repeat the measurement process. As before, you should get about the same readings, give or take 1/1000th of an inch. If you don't, then you'll have to decide what to do about it. I can't really give you any guidance here, it's up to you. Here's some troubleshooting tips for you if you're having problems getting consistent readings. The first thing to check is your 2x4 jig. Remember the problems I had with mine? Make sure that yours lies flat on the table and sits flat against the fence. If it doesn't, then attach it to a flat board like I did. And a reminder, make sure the bottom and edge are clean. Second, pay attention to how the readings change when you press on different parts of the jig. Even leaning on the table can change the measurements. So learn how to be consistent with each measurement. Third, make sure there's nothing along your fence that might cause problems. No tape, no pitch, no resin. If you have imperfections, they can affect the readings. Remember, we're talking about 1/1000th of an inch, so Little imperfections can make a difference. Be aware of those, pay attention to them, and see if they're causing problems, and if they are, measure in a different spot or take them into account. For my saw stop, when the extension is open, there's a gap here, so there's a shelf that comes out to help support any stock that I'm pushing through here. And that's not a problem, but what I need to remember when I've got the extension closed is to close the shelf, of course, but sometimes the edge of the shelf will start to stick out a little bit along here. It doesn't happen all that often, and if I'm cutting, it just gets pushed out of the way. But if I'm measuring it, it's possible it could affect the measurement, so I just need to double check that. So check your fence for any possible issues. So let's talk about how to change the fence's alignment. You'll have to jump into your manual to determine how to change your particular fence's alignment, but here's the basic procedure. Your fence will most likely have 1 or 2 bolts that keep the alignment from changing. You loosen them, change the alignment, and then tighten them back down. Then remeasure as before and keep at it until you get it right. With my old Ryobi, I loosened the 2 bolts here, then tapped the fence one way or another a little bit to change the alignment, and then tighten these bolts back down. Unfortunately, the process of tightening the bolts back down caused the alignment to change somewhat. So I always had to compensate for that by changing the alignment further than I thought it should be, and hoping that when I tightened down the bolts, it would bring them back into place. It was a pain. For this fence, I loosened this bolt, and then use a bolt on the side here to change the alignment one direction or another. Regardless of how your fence works, once you think you have it aligned, always unlock the fence and relock it, and then remeasure to make sure the readings don't change. For some fences, it works better to unlock them before changing the alignment. For others, you may have no choice but to unlock it first. With my saw stop, the manual implies that I can adjust the alignment with the fence locked down, which I can, but I don't get accurate measurements unless I unlock it once and relock it. Took me a long time to figure this out. So I'm going to realign my fence now. I'm going to double check to make sure I know exactly how much it's out of alignment. And it looks like about 7/1000ths of an inch. Pressing on the board, it looks like it's angled too much to the right and needs to go back to the left. So I move the jig out of the way and unlock the fence. I need to loosen the lock bolt, and that works best if the fence is off the table. I turn the fence over because I can get the hex key into the adjustment bolt easier this way. I make a small adjustment, guessing at how much to change it. I turn the fence back over and tighten down the lock bolt. Now I put the fence back, bring the board back over, and position the jig against the fence with the pointer on the line and at my mark, and lock the fence down. Then I check the alignment again to see how I did. Looks like I got it down from +7 to around +4 or 5. So I adjust it again. Naturally, I went too far this time, and it's off by -2 or 0.3. Let's do it one more time. That's looking pretty close, so I check it again to make sure. Looks close enough to me. For a final check, I unlock the fence, move it, and relock it. Then check the measurements again one last time. Hopefully. Woohoo! Once the alignment is adjusted properly, you should make sure that the fence still locks down easily but snugly. It's possible that the locking mechanism was affected by changing the alignment, so we're checking for that. For my fence, if the locking mechanism needs to be adjusted, there's an adjustment bolt here that tightens or loosens the clamp. It's also possible that while you're changing the alignment, you may have to adjust the locking clamp. As a final sanity check, put the blade back on and measure against the blade. As I said before, this isn't a terribly reliable method, but it'll help catch any truly bizarre problems. I forgot to mention this in part 1, but you should do this without the insert plate. The insert plate might be higher than the table in some places. It might not be even, so it could throw off the measurements. As before, pick out a flat spot on the blade, not on one of the teeth, and see if you can get a relatively close consistent reading. It's not the easiest thing to do on the blade. Then keep that spot and measure on the other side and see how close we are. And we look pretty good here. As you can see, this looks fine, so we're done. If you're having problems that I don't address or my solutions don't work, please leave a comment. Someone else may have a solution and it may help someone. Thanks. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, please click the thumbs up, leave a comment, consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks.